Today we're super lucky to have Rak Garg from Bain Capital Ventures. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so to begin with, can you just walk us through, a little bit about your background, tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Yeah, totally. So I've been a partner at BCV for the last 4 years. I invest mostly in very early stage, so sometimes even idea stage or incubation stage, AI apps and AI infrastructure ideas. I also do a lot of cybersecurity. And the way I fell into venture was largely by accident. I always wanted to be a founder. I was born in Delhi, but I grew up in the Bay Area. I grew up coding. I grew up doing pen tests, capture the flag challenges. My dad worked in cybersecurity, so security was kind of my on ramp into computing. At UCLA, I ended up doing a couple of research projects, one in machine learning and vision, and the other in cryptography. I actually really didn't like research at the time. It was very different from research today in the sense that, there were no clusters, there was no data for anything, the models didn't really work. We were trying to make image segmentation work, which today is kind of a solved use case. And there's
Mm-hmm.
there's already like big companies that are built around image segmentation. At the time, we couldn't even segment, like an apple from the background of a picture. And
Mm-hmm.
so that was kind of where we were. So I 180'd into industry, and I worked at Atlassian after college. I was an APM to start, but then ended up leading a product team that was doing a lot of work in cybersecurity, largely to enable these big enterprise customers to become customers of Atlassian's. And I loved it. I loved that experience. And so I left after about 3 years to think about what was next. I played with a couple of ideas that I wanted to start. I did a bunch of angel investing. Ultimately, Bain is on the board of Atlassian. My partner Enrique has been there for the last decade or so. And so when I met the team here, I just kind of felt like I already knew them in some way and
Mm-hmm.
ended up, learning how to invest and starting that journey.
Awesome. So I guess like you mentioned that you started as an APM, then you ended up moving up onto being a product lead. Like, what drew you to product in the first place?
I think it was a few things. I grown up very technical.
Right.
I wanted to stay very close to code and I wanted to keep coding. But I just felt like in industry, it's very different from doing engineering in your own time. When you're part of a bigger team, especially at a bigger company, I felt a little divorced from a lot of the business problems and the user problems that we were trying to solve.
Right.
And I think that became clear for me during a few different internships. So all of my internships during college were largely software engineering internships.
Mm-hmm.
I worked at a couple of smaller companies, a couple of really big companies. And I think the unifying factor was sort of that, I was kind of I was enjoying the process of building, but I was kind of removed
Right.
from choosing what to build, or choosing how to measure what we build, or choosing what success would look like, or what we should build next. And I just wanted to get closer to that. So product felt like a natural extension. And
Mm-hmm.
then the other part of it was that security is a very technical domain, right? A
Mm-hmm.
lot of security is actually a data problem. You're crunching all these logs. You're trying to provide this really rich API for telemetry or for figuring out what went wrong. And so the PMs that work on security products also have to be kind of technical.
Mm-hmm.
And I think those two things just sort of lined up for me, which is what drew me to product in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that totally makes sense. So you mentioned you sort of like spend a little bit of time at Atlassian, I think a little bit around 2 years. Like, walk us through briefly, like, how was your time there? How do you feel like you grew over that time? And also, sort of like, what types of skills do you think have translated from that time?
Yeah, totally. I loved Atlassian. I really enjoyed it. I think there's parts of making a small team pull off really incredible things that is just sort of universal, whether it's at a startup or at a larger company.
Right.
At Atlassian, I just grew a lot. It was my first time kind of hiring people, trying to retain people. It was certainly my first time, performance managing people.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, it was also my first time thinking about how to say no to customers who were very opinionated
Mm-hmm.
and paid Atlassian a lot of money.
Right.
And so dealing with those kinds of conversations, learning how to structure a roadmap. When you're starting a new product at a big company, it's kind of like nobody wants to, no one is interested in supporting the little product because
Right.
it's kind of like, there's a successful company that's built around doing other things. And
Mm-hmm.
so any time that someone spends on something new is not really, from the company's point of view, a great use of their time. And that's kind
Mm-hmm.
of how we end up with things like the innovator's dilemma.
Mm-hmm.
At Atlassian, I felt the opposite. I felt like almost everybody that I would come across was just really excited and interested about doing new things, and so that
Mm-hmm.
was what kept me there, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Beyond that, when I left Atlassian, I had been thinking a lot about this problem of how do you cross the chasm? So PLG, yeah, I left Atlassian in 2021. PLG was kind of like the flavor that year. Everybody was talking about how to become a product-led growth company. How do you obviate sales out of the process of go-to-market? And so a lot of the work that I had done in security was trying to enable this transition from product-led growth, layering on enterprise sales organically, instead of trying to do, cold outreach or cold calling or the stuff that BDRs and AEs are infamous for doing. And so when I decided to start investing, that was kind of the flavor of what I
Mm-hmm.
would help founders with. There was a lot of people building bottom-up developer tools, people building bottom-up AI infrastructure tools.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of these products invariably run into the same set of challenges, which is, you end up getting some amount of GitHub stars. You end
Mm-hmm.
up with some robust community. How do you actually generate revenue from
Mm-hmm.
that? And so that was where I spent my energy for the first couple of years of investing. And
Mm-hmm.
that was just channeling a lot of what I had learned at Atlassian.
Okay, yeah, no, that totally makes sense. So I guess you mentioned that you got into venture by an accident, sort of like walk us through like how that actually ended up happening.
Yeah, totally. By the time I left Atlassian, I'd been feeling like product was a little bit narrow in the
Mm-hmm.
sense that I was only ever talking to Atlassian customers.
Mm-hmm.
I was only incentivized to think about what was next for Jira and Confluence and Trello and the other big products that the company has.
Mm-hmm.
And this is not unique to like an Atlassian product manager. I think a good
Mm-hmm.
PM is obsessed about their company's trajectory, their company's users, their company's roadmap.
Mm-hmm.
But I just kind of wanted to diversify. I wanted to think about other problems. I wanted to go to support people in other industries. I think the turning point for me was that a college roommate had gone into YC as a founder.
Mm-hmm.
And sort of like after work, nights and weekends, I was just helping that team kind of think about monetizing, think about security, think about how do you win these big companies.
Mm-hmm.
And I just really liked it. And they had nothing to do really with like developer productivity, which is what Atlassian is known for.
Mm-hmm.
And so I just wanted to keep doing that. And then I met through him other YC founders who I also got the chance to work with informally or advise formally. And so over time, I looked at that and I was kind of like, maybe entrepreneurship is like the thing that I should go do. And I had a
Okay.
bunch of these opinions on what was missing in the world of cybersecurity, specifically in SaaS security. So SaaS security posture management was kind of the area that I had been thinking about for a while.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Venture for me was kind of the result of a failed ideation process. Like
Mm-hmm.
I had gone and met with maybe 100, 120 CISOs, chief security officers,
Mm-hmm.
and I pitched them on this idea of, having a single pane of glass to control all of your SaaS apps permissions from. Certainly not a new idea, but I didn't know that at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And none of it really worked, right? Like people were always nice and polite, and they were like, "Oh yeah, this is cool. I can
Yeah.
see myself using this." And then
Yeah, of course.
then you drop the hammer, and you're like, "Great, 80K. Will you pay me?" and then
No.
and then everybody's like, "Oh, it's not a priority for this year. Maybe
Yeah.
next year. Like it's not a thing that we're worried about right now."
Right.
And so that was pretty clear to me as a PM. Like I was like, okay, whatever I'm working on, it's just not valuable
Yeah.
to people in the market.
Yeah.
And venture kind of came up at the same time as I was having those thoughts. And so I thought this would be a great way to figure out what actually works.
Mm-hmm.
Like how do these entrepreneurs become successful? How do these companies end up converging to something that people actually pay money for?
Mm-hmm.
So that was why I joined BCV originally. It was, go learn how this stuff works and then, maybe someday become a better founder. But
Mm-hmm.
ultimately I've just really enjoyed investing, and
Mm-hmm.
now I can't really imagine
Yeah.
myself going and doing something else because this is like a totally different craft, which I've really loved.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. I mean, you've done really well in investing. I guess like maybe most notably you invested in Docker, which is was probably a really exciting investment. I know they've done quite well. How was the process of doing that?
Yeah. Docker was an interesting one. I mean, the company has been through a number of different lives, I
Yeah.
should say, right? I mean, Docker 1.0 was kind of this obviously very popular open source project, but
Mm-hmm.
didn't really monetize. And then Docker 2.0 became kind of a services business around this idea of containerization.
Mm-hmm.
And now I think we're in Docker 3.0, which
Mm-hmm.
is, there's a cohesive story and set of products and pricing around I think what made Docker the open source so successful. And so
Mm-hmm.
Docker Cloud, Docker Swarm, Docker for desktop, like a lot of these products have taken shape in a way that I think enterprises are really, appreciating and glomming onto.
Mm-hmm.
The process of investing was, we ask ourselves at the start of every year, what is a set of companies that, you know, the companies of the future cannot exist without. Like I think every infrastructure investor should ask themselves this question of like, what can't you build today,
Right.
and what's the limitation, right? And so if you ask me the question today in 2025, I would have an answer around local models, edge inference, etc.
Mm-hmm.
When we invested in Docker, it was that Docker was already a growth company, but you literally couldn't build a number
Right.
of these services or really anything in modern cloud world without Docker. There is no viable alternative really outside of a few different open source projects.
Mm-hmm.
And so that to us, that nature of ubiquity, that nature of like being a great unlock was kind of the thesis behind it. And it's worked out, really well so far.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, awesome. So, recently you've invested in Unstructured and Decagon. Like what sort of drove that?
So I think both of those companies fit this theme of services to software.
Okay.
If you go back 2 years, so to 2022, before ChatGPT, we had been getting very involved within the research communities, both in industry and at different academic labs.
Mm-hmm.
And we were following a lot of the research around kind of these larger, more scalable models.
Mm-hmm.
And so going back to the Docker question of like, what can't you build today without
Mm-hmm.
something else existing?
Mm-hmm.
Unstructured, I think, a very good example of that, where before unstructured, if you wanted to get any kind of intelligence out of your documents, your different applications, your different like data silos inside of a company, you basically had two options. You could either outsource it to a BPO, usually overseas, and then you're paying kind of per page, and maybe some things they get right, some things they get wrong in your time, or you're going to go use something like a major service from a major cloud provider, and then that's a little bit more automated. But then you have to go build a lot of the pipelining stuff yourself, and you have to go and maintain all the infrastructure around it, and that's not actually cheap either. So that was kind of the world pre-unstructured. With unstructured, we felt that Brian, who's the CEO, had this really clear thesis around models getting good enough to actually do OCR and then eventually do full document intelligence.
Yeah.
And then this thing called RAG happened, which the founders of Contextual AI, where we also invested, really commercialized and brought forward that technology, which was a great boon for companies like Decagon and Unstructured. So the thesis there was really, you couldn't do this before without services. There's a whole set of applications you can't build without this. And there is an opportunity to, I think, go and build something resembling a Fivetran of unstructured data, right? Like a full-scale ETL provider that just kind of always runs, is dependable, handles scheduling, retries, caching, et cetera. I think the models are finally catching up to where unstructured's workflow technology is.
Got it. Okay.
In Decagon's case, I think we start from a similar premise of like, what do companies do today to deal with the onslaught of customer support? You can either hire more people and train them and then lose them, or you can go and outsource to an MSP or a BPO or something else. And in both cases, you're kind of left with a very high churn, very expensive, low CSAT, low customer satisfaction score, kind of offering or team. And in Decagon's case, we saw these really clear proof points of companies who were able to, 10 times, sometimes even 20 times what their human support teams could do with Decagon AI. And so we were seeing ticket deflection rates that were, very, very high. We were seeing customer satisfaction rates go through the roof. And so there's sometimes this stigma about like, I don't want to talk to a robot, give me a real person. In Decagon's case, we find that they use the models in such a way that people love it because they get their answers a lot faster. They don't have to wait as long, et cetera. And so I think in both of those cases, the founders were just incredible. They fit this theme of services to software, and then they executed on that theme really, really well.
Yeah. Okay. Awesome. Yeah. I mean, I think that already sort of answers the question of what you look for companies very well. So I think we can go ahead and skip that one. So I guess like continuing on, like obviously a lot of the people that are going to be like looking at this podcast and sort of understanding these sort of like ideas are coming from an early career engineering and research background. So that could be undergrads, master's students, PhD students, early career engineers at big tech, unicorn, quant, or even mid-level people. I guess like some of these people might be interested in building their own company. Some of them might be interested in working at a fast growing company. Like what type of advice do you think you could give them for those two different archetypes?
I think if you're trying to build a company, the observability of these industries from the outside has never been higher.
Mm-hmm.
And Andreessen actually had a really good blog post about this a
Mm-hmm.
few days ago or a few weeks ago. But if you went back 10 years or even 5 years to when I
Mm-hmm.
started venture, if we had looked at these very niche vertical industries like OCR or like support, we would always ask this question of, well, what is your right to win? Like, what is the founder market fit? Have you done this before? Have you been in a support role before? A lot of those sorts of questions.
Mm-hmm.
I think today we meet young teams who have, uh, never really worked in these industries, but have just gotten up to speed really quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And so
Right.
the accessibility of the people in these fields is much greater. The accessibility of customers is much greater.
Right.
I think one of the reasons for that is, 5 years ago, nobody was dying to use your technology.
Mm-hmm.
You'd go to a customer, you'd be like, hey, look, I have cloud, I have microservices. And they'd be like, why do I care? Like,
Yeah.
what problem do you solve for me? Today, every company is being shouted at by the board to go and figure out AI, right? And like Toby from Shopify is a really good example of this. He wrote this memo that went out to every employee contractor at the company. And he was like, look, you can do your job the way you want. I think that your job is going to be done 100 times better if you use AI.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't use AI, look, you can do whatever you want, but you will get outcompeted, right? And so like that is kind of his message to his own company. And so if you're trying to build something today, I would suggest go run down a couple of different industries that you find interesting, figure out all the problems within them, and then figure out how inclined they are to actually use new technology. Because there's a number of industries that are just low margin that
Yeah.
frankly don't have the money to pay for technology. Maybe those are not the right fit. But
Mm-hmm.
then in those same verticals, there are sometimes higher margin businesses that have this immense pressure that you can go and win.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you're trying to go and work at an early stage company, I think something underrated that a lot of people don't do is they don't talk to investors. Like investors tend to
Mm-hmm.
have so much more information
Yeah.
about what's going well, what isn't. The job is trying to see around the curve. And so if you're a young person who wants to go work at a great company, I would suggest reaching out to me or any of my colleagues at BCV because this is what we do for a living. We help place people in companies that do really well.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And if you want to reach out to Rak, his email will be in the description, but it's also like rgarg, Garg, at bankcapital.com. Awesome. So I guess like just to sort of wrap things up, you sort of mentioned some areas that you're excited by. We talked about unstructured document processing. We talked about Decagon AI agents for customer support. Where do you sort of see the industry going in the next few years? Obviously, it's a very tumultuous time. There is a large amount of things going on, both financially and in terms of advancement. But I guess like at a high level, are there some areas that you think are really exciting?
Totally, man. I mean, I asked myself the question of what has been outsourced or been done manually before that we can actually go feasibly capture today.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people have talked about this idea of like AI killing the BPO or AI killing Accenture.
Mm-hmm.
I actually don't think either of those things will happen. Like, I
Mm-hmm.
think that the best BPOs are learning how to use AI.
Right.
I think Accenture has a bunch of really smart people who are building these products in house and
Mm-hmm.
deploying them and figuring out a way to make it work with their billable hours model.
Mm-hmm.
The question I ask is, where can you drive outcomes in
Mm-hmm.
a service first way?
Mm-hmm.
So there's a few different areas for this. Like
Mm-hmm.
if you look at implementations within the SaaS ecosystem,
Mm-hmm.
ServiceNow, SAP, Oracle, Databricks, etc.
Mm-hmm.
There's a number of partners who do really well, right? Like these
Mm-hmm.
partners are trusted. They're like top GSIs. Then for every one of those, there's 1,000 little partners who
Mm-hmm.
don't do nearly as good of a job, who
Mm-hmm.
are under-resourced, very constrained, maybe don't do as well in delivery. I feel like AI native firms will go and consolidate a bunch of those players and become kind of like the future GSIs of
Mm-hmm.
tomorrow. And
Mm-hmm.
so I don't worry so much about AI killing Accenture. I think
Right.
about if I could rebuild Accenture today,
Yeah.
what would that look like?
Mm-hmm.
What kind of balance structure or balance sheet or margin structure would that have?
Mm-hmm.
That's one area. The second I think about a lot is security.
Yeah.
So security from two angles. One is security historically has been this very manual, very fragmented set of workflows that people are just kind of struggling to put into production because of all of the, thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of vulnerabilities that are being thrown at you.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wonder, what are the parts of an average security person's job that they would rather not do that an
Mm-hmm.
AI could feasibly go do?
Mm-hmm.
And that looks like simple things. That looks like, are you in that country? Like this is something very, very typical that an IT or security person has to go figure out.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think a lot about these like systems of agents that can go and do a lot of the grunt work for someone in security so that they can focus on these more scalable foundational ways to do detections, do other things.
Hmm. Awesome. And I guess like, are there any skills that you think that engineers and researchers should pick up? Like obviously, we've talked a little bit about agents, we've talked a little bit about like document processing, we talked a little bit about like dev tools and infra. Like, like I guess the thing is like the tech landscape right now is changing very fast, and there's like AI agent frameworks like LangChain, and these things are sort of like constantly evolving. Um, I think like like with the advent of like Cursor and like Windsurf and all of these other sort of like agents, I think front end dev is becoming a lot more easily automated. Obviously, there's also Lovable and tons of these other apps. What skills do you think that these engineers and researchers should start to pivot towards, aside from just like ML?
Yeah, I mean, look, whenever you build something new, there's three kinds of risks you should think about. There's team risk, execution risk, and market risk.
Hmm.
Team risk, no one can really help you with. I mean,
Yeah.
you just have to said Windsurf, Codium, Lovable, Bolt, etc. A lot of these products have really de-risked execution for you
Right.
because you can now go to prototype and get into a customer, ridiculously fast, way faster than you ever could before.
Right.
Market risk is something that has been very hard to crack, right?
Hmm.
Like, are you building the right thing? Is a question that
Right.
only your customers can answer. And I think too many founders are not very good at elucidating truth from
Right.
customers.
Right.
So my advice to, like, if you're someone who's technical, if you're a researcher, you already work in ML, you're an AI engineer, I think Silicon Valley people tend to be quite reductive of non-tech industries.
Right.
And I think what we should instead do is you should just go fly to NorCal and spend time at a sawmill, right? Like
Yeah.
you should just go fly to Carolina, North Carolina, and go figure out how like the research triangle companies operate. Like you should go and spend time in these areas with these customers and try to elucidate some kind of truth about like a problem that you can tractably solve. Because I believe that anybody can build anything today. Like I
Hmm.
don't necessarily believe unless it's like a deep AI of moats in the things you choose to build.
Hmm.
It's do you choose to build the right things or not?
Hmm. Okay, makes sense. Awesome. Well, thanks for your time, Rak. Very, very helpful feedback. Yeah, I hope everyone gets to reach out to Rak. His email will be in the description. Definitely reach out. Also, read, I think it's Rak's Facts, I want to say, the Substack. Yeah, it's very cutely named.
Yeah,
Also,
you got it.
you can also search him up on Twitter. If you don't use Twitter yet and you're interested in entrepreneurship, might be a helpful thing to get on. Yeah, awesome. Well, yeah, thanks again, Rack. Really appreciate it.
Of course, man. Thank you for having me.